This is ILF Radio, our weekly podcast, where we peek into the soul of Indian heritage with our esteemed guests and listen through the old seasoned walls. This week, we're visiting the sanctum of Thanjavur temples. Revolving around the paintings, music, dance, and drama traditions of the Cholas, we look into their history through literary as well as oral sources. Built with the mechanism to last for thousands of years, the evolution of Thanjavur temples from small brick constructions to massive stone structures is an engineering marvel for all generations to witness. Its rich sculptural elements and intricate carvings have truly been a work of panache. Delving into the rich inscription on temple walls, we talk about administration, role of women, and the Devdasi tradition during Cholas in a new light, and how temples acted as important political, social, and economic authorities of the time. So let's explore the very beautiful Thanjavur temples of Cholamandalam.
Hi, I'm Priya from India Lost and Found, and we're here for another episode, this time with Dr. Pradeep Chakrabarty. We're exploring the beauty and significance of the Thanjavur temples in Tamil Nadu. Our guest is an HR consultant and a historian from Chennai. He is an alumnus of the London School of Economics and has spent over 2 decades in HR and training. But that's not the only place where his skills lie. He has written extensively about Tamil Nadu's history and art and has 5 books to his name already. He has given multiple insightful talks about how one can understand the present and future cultural dynamics by first exploring the past. We look forward to learning from his deep knowledge of ancient Tamil history and literature. But first, let's talk about the temples. The temples in Thanjavur, Tamil Nadu, embody the finest traditions of Dravidian architecture and art. They began being constructed during the reign of the Pallavas, which lasted approximately between the 3rd and the 9th centuries, and reached the pinnacle of magnificence during the rule of the Cholas, which was from the 9th to the 13th century. The Chola dynasty is one of the longest ruling dynasties in the world, and it needn't come as a surprise that during this period, the powerful rulers constructed these places of worship, besides some very noteworthy practical infrastructure, such as the famous Kallanai Dam, one of the oldest dams in the world. Out of the many temples, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, labeled as Great Living Chola Temples, includes 3 magnificent temples in Thanjavur and its vicinity. They are Airavateshwara Temple near Kumbakonam, Brihadishwarar Temple, which is also known as the Big Temple in Thanjavur, and Gangaikonda Cholapuram Temple in Jayakondam. Apart from these, there are many architectural and artistic gems of the Chola period strewn in and around Thanjavur. The temples in Thanjavur are a glowing example of the grandeur of Dravidian architecture that scaled the peaks of glory during the rule of the Cholas. With our guest today, we're going to explore just a little bit of their remarkable eminence. Pradeep, thank you for joining us today and welcome to ILF Radio.
Thank you very much, Priya. Pleasure to be here.
While we are here talking about Thanjavur, let us first begin with Thanjavur, its geographic, historic, and cultural placement in our world. Could you tell us a little about that?
I think that's an excellent place to start. Because the history of Thanjavur, the reason that it is so important in the cultural history of India is primarily because of its geographic location. When we speak about Thanjavur, we speak both about a district and a town. And if you look at the district and the town on the map, it's on either side of the banks of the Kaveri River. The Kaveri is a perennial river. It originates in Karnataka and then it flows through Tamil Nadu. And Thanjavur is at the part where the Kaveri is joined by many different tributaries, and towards closer towards the Thiruvarur, what is now the Thiruvarur district, but was originally part of the Thanjavur district, the Kaveri splits into many smaller rivers before it eventually joins the sea. which is called the Delta region.
Right.
This means that the entire region is extremely fertile, and that is the key reason why the Pallavas, the Cholas, and in fact many of the South Indian dynasties fought to own some part of that land, and also why the Cholas were so famous.
When this set of constructions began, there must have been some chronology to it. With centuries defining the temple architecture of Thanjavur, can we pick out a ruler or a time period that started it all and began the intricate history of these historical gems?
That's a little difficult if you look at it just from written sources. We have to look at oral traditions as well, because in India, oral traditions are as important, if not more important, for history.
Right.
By the way, I'm not a doctor yet. I've submitted my PhD, which is on the irrigation and political systems of the Pandyas, who ruled further down south in a very arid region. If you compare the Pandyas and the Cholas, you'll find the importance of water in the creation of a kingdom. The Pandyas ruled the southern extremity of Tamil Nadu, which is a very dry and arid land, where they had to build multiple ponds and lakes to augment the water, and they managed rainwater harvesting. In the Chola region, it was largely through canals, and water was distributed through canals to the different fields, and therefore it was also very, very fertile. And because much of the Chola region was also on the Coromandel coast, you had a trade that was developed between the Cholas and Southeast Asia as well, which is why even today, many parts of Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, they all have some remnants of the Tamil culture, primarily because of the Cholas. So we don't have many of the temples from the Pallava period. In fact, it's very unlikely that there were many Pallava temples in the Chola region. But what we do know from epics like the Silappatikaram, which is at least about 1,800 years old, is there were many, many temples in that region, but these temples were largely objects of nature that were deified. And remember, at that time, man or women's connection with nature was far, far closer. So they actually saw God in nature, or goddess in nature. So a tree, a river, a sacred mountain were all sacred, and the whole tree, the mountain, or the river itself would have been venerated as a goddess or a god. So structural temples would have been very, very few in number. Then slowly, as the land was cultivated further, there were more dams, there were more check dams, there were more Picotta wells, there were better irrigation facilities. Therefore, the food production increased. Because the food production increased, the wealth of the community increased. People felt that not having just small temples which were in the middle of nowhere, which was open to the skies, were not enough for them. They had a lot more money to spend, and that's how temples started being built. The earliest temples would have been made out of brick. Very, very rare in the Thanjavur district to see brick temples. There is one in Vepattur, which is not very far off from Kumbakonam, the Airavateshwara temple, which is a very broken down brick temple. It's hardly used now. But very few brick temples like that exist, because when the Cholas came to power in about 1,000 years back, they were extremely good administrators. They had a lot of money in their bank, and they were able to reconstruct all these brick temples into stone temples and build new ones as well. So Priya, it's like when I first started earning my salary, I didn't get much money. I might have just been able to afford a motorbike. Then when I made a little bit more money, I bought a car. Now I have maybe 2 cars and a really expensive car. Temples have the same structure. When the society is simple, they don't have a lot of cash, the temples remain simple. When the society starts accumulating cash, the temples become grander and grander, because everything that we expect from the government to do for us today, the temple did for the local community. So if we need to understand Chola temples, or in fact any temple in South India, if not in India, we need to see them beyond religious institutions, because they were social, political, and economic institutions first. And anything that the community wanted in the local, in their needs, was given by the temple for that local community.
How interesting is that? In your answer, you have talked about the social, political, the economic structure of the society, of the community, of the entire system in its nascent stage. and how it all probably began with the worship of nature and then got its religious texture with it. And it's very interesting to see how things must have developed. And what makes it even more fascinating is that we know little about it. But do we know some of the distinctive characteristics of these temples, and what were their functions in the later stages, at least?
Sure. So when the transition from the brick temples to the stone temples happened, we really struck gold, because on the walls of these stone temples, the Pallavas and of course even people like Ashoka the Great had already done it before, of this habit of recording edicts or recording royal orders on stone. But the Cholas really took it to very, very high levels of expertise. So in India, in total, some scholars have estimated that there are about 60,000 lines of inscription. What is an inscription? It is writing on the stone of an important royal or a social order that had to be looked after. So it's like our website today, or maybe even the government's gazette that comes out every month or whatever it is. So these orders have been found across India. Out of the 60 to 70,000, at least 40,000 of them are from Tamil Nadu alone. And out of these 40,000, the majority of them are actually from the Chola period. So on the walls of these temples, we have very, very detailed accounts of administration of the politics, economics, and social society of the Chola period. Nothing which is religious and mythological. All of this is very, very hardcore administrative related, and from that we can understand the role that the temples played in the local community. So let's take the Brihadishwara temple, for example. Yeah? Many large parcels of land was donated to the temple by Rajaraja when he built the temple. We have detailed accounts of where this land is, what was the composition of the land, and how it was made tax-free. Now we also have we have many inscriptions of jewelry that was given to the Brihadishwara temple. We know, for example, pearls were graded in 10 different types. Diamonds were graded in 16 different types. So when the king gave a necklace to the temple, we know the weight of the necklace. We have a rough idea of how the necklace looked. We know the weight of the stones in the necklace. We know the quality of the stones. We even know the amount of lac that was used to bind the necklace gold and the stones together. And all of this and when it came to the bronze deities or the idols that were given to the temple, we even have their detailed measurements. So each of these, the Brihadishwara temple, Airavateshwara temple, not that many inscriptions. But the Gangekonda Cholapuram temple as well has some inscriptions. All of these not only are visually beautiful in terms of their structure, but they also have very valuable information on the administration of the Chola period. And when you look at why are these three the most important temples, some of the earliest Chola temples are places in Srinivasanallur, Punjai, Kodumbalur, and they're off the beaten track. These important ones are worthy of deeper study, because this is when the total mastery of the Chola architecture happened. They were able to use stone to build massive structures, and it makes it more remarkable to remember that this granite is probably the world's hardest, most densest stone. Granite was taken from the Pudukkottai region, which is a good 100 kilometers away from Thanjavur. It was brought over about 1,000 years back through the river network system. So the river networks work both for agriculture and for architecture as well. And then they were cut by hand, chiseled, and then erected in a way that no binding material is used. If you look at these stunning photographs of the Brihadishwara temple, the Airavateshwara temple, and the Brihadishwara temple of Gangekonda Cholapuram, all of these were built by using massive blocks of stone, which were hewn out with just a chisel and a hammer, and the alignment is perfect. Everything is right angles. In fact, in the gopuram of the central tower, each stone sits in a perfectly balanced position one over another, so that the entire vimana in the middle, over the Sanctum Sanctorum or the Garbhagriha, is completely hollow. And Gangekonda Cholapuram, which has the Brihadishwara temple, Rajendra Chola, to commemorate his victory or campaign to the Gangetic plain, he actually built something called the Chola Ganga, which was the Ganga of the Cholas, which was not really a river, but it was a massive lake. And the lake has become much smaller today. But even today, it is truly awe-inspiring. So all the time when you have to understand Chola art and architecture, you need to understand the water system and the irrigation and the agriculture, because that's what gave them the money to do all this.
So, like in any society, whether it's modern or ancient, what we need to see is that everything is interconnected. So we're talking about temples here, but we're also discussing engineering and economics. That's fascinating. Do we know any of the exciting stories about the building process itself, or the use of these temples besides religious activities? You've mentioned inscriptions, but could there be some other usages of the premises?
Right. So when you look at the building traditions of the Tanjavur Brihadeshwara temple, for example, there's a very, very erroneous misconception that the top stupa is actually one block of stone. It's not. It's about 8 pieces of stone. And there's a lot of fancy stories about how a village close by was used to build a ramp. I don't think the Cholas were that complicated in the way they thought. They were very good civil engineers. And remember, all of these were people who were qualified in Vimanarchana and other civil engineering texts, and they knew it in their mind. They didn't have textbooks to refer to, and they would have drawn it out, and they would have understood how the trigonometry and everything works, and they would have made it. They would have used circular ramps to actually move the stone up. Definitely elephants and a lot of human labor would have been used as well. But we don't have any of these texts. So why don't we have any of the methods in which they use? Because the tradition of Indian history has been to record what is eternal. And what is eternal is not about how something has to be built, but what the emphasis is. And the emphasis is that we cannot comprehend the universal power with our 5 senses, but we seek to be connected with that universal power through our 5 senses. Therefore, as a surrogate, we need a temple and an idol. So a temple and an idol are really all the vastu, or what we cannot describe, what we cannot perceive. All of that is brought onto the floor, and then it is converted into a building with a deity for us to help us focus our attention on, so that we will be able to connect with nature and with ourselves. This is why, if you look at the Brihadeshwara temple, for example, it's a perfect alignment. If you look at the floor plan, it's a perfect alignment of 2 squares. And in the second square, in the center, is the Shivalingam and the hollow structure of the Vimana, which means that in a way, the greatness of Shiva is beyond the cosmos. But we are, for the sake of our own limited understanding, we're bringing him inside a Shivalinga. And even then, we are remembering that he is a part of the cosmos by keeping the tower over him absolutely empty and not closed off. So this is the philosophic interpretation. If you look at some of the other interesting inscriptions across the Chola country, Thirumukkudal is a place not very far off from Chennai. There is a temple there which has a very long inscription that records the donation of a large hospital, a school, a Vedic school, and a pharmacy and a hospital with beds for students and for people in the local area by Rajendra Chola, who also built the Gangaikonda Cholapuram temple. And we have detailed accounts of the land that was given. We have the list of medicines that need to be kept in the pharmacy. We have the number of students for each of the Vedic subjects that were taught. We have the number of teachers who had to be allocated, the salary for the teachers. And let me just leave 1 or 2 interesting trivia for you. All the students who stayed in the hostel, they were all allowed to sleep on mats. They were given a lamp for use in the night. And they were allowed to have a hot water oil bath every Saturday, for which the hot water for which there was extra firewood, and they had separate nurses as well. And all the patients in the hospital, they had meals delivered to them, and there was a special cook to make all of these things. So this is the kind of trivia that you have.
I asked for exciting stories, and you've given me many. That's but please go on.
Right. So in Tanjavur also there were many hospitals. So we have inscriptions in Tanjavur of hospitals, but sadly we don't have any of those inscriptions, so we don't know much. The other temple in Tanjavur that I must talk about for people who will be entranced by these beautiful photographs and go and visit Tanjavur, this is the Nishumba Sodhini temple. The Nishumba Sodhini temple is a tiny, tiny temple. It's probably smaller than our living rooms many times over. It has a stunning image of Durga, and very appropriate since we are recording it just after Vijayadashami. There's a stunning image of Durga in all her fury slaying Mahishasura, and on her earlobe are a pair of earrings, and on one earring is a little human form. The priest will tell you that is a little baby which Durga has taken in her mercy and put on the earring, but that's not a baby. It's actually a human corpse. It's a human corpse that she has defeated, and she's in so much of anger and in that heroic Veera Rasa. She's actually draped it on her earring. This temple is the oldest Chola temple that we have in Tanjavur, and it was built by Vijayalaya. Vijayalaya Chola conquered Tanjavur, and he built this temple, and appropriately, this Durga temple is facing the north with her back to the south. And the reason for this is that the south is the side of not only Shiva, but Yamaloka as well. And when Durga faces the south, she turns her back towards defeat and death, and she looks towards the north, which symbolifies life and power. And there are many other temples like this, Priya, but we've gone through a few today.
This is, and it is, I'm pretty sure it's in a way endless, isn't it? There must be so many stories and so many things to know.
Yes. I think if we get into the lens of looking at the beauty of an image of a temple and asking ourselves, why did this structure survive for such a long time? What was its relevance in the social community around it that helped it live for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, whatever? It's number one. The second is, what was the way in which this temple construction was funded? If these images that we see through this project, if it can excite us to think about these two questions, I'm sure we'll find different answers, and they will be useful for us to not only appreciate the image more deeply, but also for us to understand the context of the monument of which the image is.
I agree with you, and I'm going to come back to this thought in one of the questions later. But right now, I want to explore a little bit about what lay people like me know of Tanjavur. Of course, we know of the temples, but when we hear the word Tanjavur, we talk about the painting. Can it be connected to the temple architecture? How did it develop, and is it related to the architecture somehow?
It's very important in the context of Tanjavur not to just talk about the Cholas. Of course, they were very great. But after the Cholas came the Telugu-speaking Nayaks. And after them came the Maratha rulers of Tanjavur. So the Maratha Tanjavur ruler was actually a stepbrother of Shivaji the Great. And when he conquered Tanjavur, he sold his other Jagir, which was Bangalore, to the Mysore king, and he consolidated Tanjavur. Both the Telugu-speaking Nayaks who came in the 16th, 17th centuries and the Marathas who ruled in the 17th, 18th centuries and a little bit of the 19th century, they are important for us to know because they help do their bit to preserve the Chola temples. And I think this is a very important philosophic tradition that we have in India, a social tradition that we have in India, that every ruler who comes to power, they look at how can they improve and build on the Hindu traditions that have been there before. So both the Nayaks and the Marathas, they added small pieces to the Brihadishwara temple and to the Gangekota Cholapuram temple, not so much to the Airavateshwara temple because that was Kumbakonam a little farther away. But they also look at how can they be inspired by some of the work of the great Cholas. Of course, the Vijayanagar king, the Tanjavur Nayak kings and the Maratha kings were much smaller. They didn't, while they ruled parts of the Chola land, they weren't that administratively efficient as the Cholas were. They didn't have a lot of cash, but they still tried to do their bit. And it is because of them, they also constantly introduce new traditions of painting, which is why Tanjavur is probably, Priya, the only place in India which has a continuous tradition of innovation in painting from about 1,000 years till date. You have the Chola period murals of the Brihadishwara temple, which are stunning images of medieval South Indian art on the walls, the use of colors, the use of movement, the use of imagery to tell a story. All of these are extremely important. Then we have the Nayak traditions of the dry fresco method, the Tanjavur paintings of the Marathas, and much later great artists like Rajam, who was also from the Tanjavur district. So when we look at the Maratha traditions, this tradition of painting on wooden boards has been there for a long time. In fact, in the Brihadishwara temple, in the first floor, there is a Chola period mural of Rajaraja sitting to the left in front of a little mantapa, and in that mantapa is a very clearly wooden frame, exactly like the painting that I have in the back. Very clearly marked painting of with a wooden frame with an image of Nataraja or Shiva as the god of dance, and that, who was the Chola's tutelary deity and Rajaraja's favorite deity. So we don't know whether that painting was paint on wood or paint on cloth on wood. The Tanjore painting tradition is when a cloth is affixed to the board, wooden board, and it is painted. Gesso work used to be very, very thin. Gesso is actually a paste of tamarind seed, crushed tamarind seed, which becomes like a glue. Sometimes it's very fine clay, or it could be very fine sawdust. The earliest Tanjore paintings, the National Museum in Delhi has a very good collection. The Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum in Bombay also has a very good collection. These early paintings from about the 1830s or 40s, they wouldn't have had a lot of glass or stones embedded. They'd have just used the raised work of the gesso and then gold foil painted on the top. Then, of course, later on, they became more and more fabric. So definitely when we look at Tanjavur, we need to look at all this. And Priya, most important, we need to look at food. During the Maratha period in about the 18th century, there was a very great king called Sarfoji II, and he authored or patronized 2 or 3 food books. One is called the Sarabendra Bhaga Shastram, which is available in print in the Saraswati Mahal Library. You have recipes from the Maratha royal court in English, Marathi, and Tamil. And then you have other books called the Vaidya Ratnavali and others, which were food that was created for medicinal purposes. And even today, the finest tradition of Tanjavur is the art of chewing pan. It's a very long and complex tradition. There's a full account of how to do it in my book called Tanjavur, A Cultural History.
Wow.
But anything about the good life, Priya, in Tamil Nadu, the finest antiques, the finest metalware, the lamps, so textiles. We have the Kodali Karapur sari, which is a very, very rare, painstakingly done work of textile, which is also from Tanjavur. The musical instruments that are made in Tanjavur, the food of Tanjavur, everything, anything connected with culture and art, there's something in Tanjavur for you to look at.
I can't believe that we're talking about temples and we've discussed pan and the mouth-watering stuff with textiles and everything. This is
well, temples were very important for the feast that they served. No?
Right.
And many Chola inscriptions give us across the Chola temples. They give us lists of the kind of food that was served. The dosa, the idli, the puttu, the puliodara, the thair sadam, all the stuff that we have in a traditional Tamil lunch. All of these were served in the Chola period.
So since the temples are actually essentially the hub of cultural and social growth, this must be the place where the Carnatic music and Bharatnatyam somehow grew or developed. Could we know a little about that?
Indeed. I'm glad you asked that question, because the tradition of music and dance and indeed even drama, they were all primarily patronized in the temple in the Chola period. In fact, we know that in the Brihadishwara temple, Rajaraja had a drama written about his own conquest and his greatness, and they were performed there by a community called the Devadasis. Now, unfortunately, Priya, today, most ordinary people equate a Devadasi with a prostitute, and that is very, very, very wrong. In the Chola period, and in fact, indeed, right up till about the 18th century or the early 19th century, Devadasis were anything but that. The entire tradition of music, dance, and drama was seen as not just something for entertainment, but a form of puja. And because it was a form of puja, it was one of the Shodasha Upachara, or one of the 16 Upacharas or royal rites that were given for a god or a king. And therefore, you had a group of women called the Devadasis who were dedicated to the god and lived close to the temple, and it was their job to do the music and the dance performances in the temple. In the Brihadishwara temple, we know that Rajaraja had about 300 Devadasi women from different villages in his kingdom. He had them relocated, and we have their names. We have the house plot, the door number, the address where they lived and where they were given a free house. And we are also told that if she passed away, what was the criteria required for a new person to be appointed in her place. And all these Devadasi women, yes, they were not married, they were married to the god, they were free to have relationships otherwise, but they had the power to independently own and transfer property of their own, which was unheard of for most women of that period. So here was a group of women who, because of their knowledge of the arts, they had an extremely important role in society. And in fact, many of the public irrigation projects that were commissioned were actually commissioned by the Devadasis in medieval Tamil Nadu. These Devadasis, we have some information about the music and the dance that we did, but sadly we don't know their traditions, because in 1947, when the Devadasi Abolition Act came into force, that entire tradition vanished, and many of them were sadly reduced to the level of being prostitutes. But yes, but if you look at the music traditions, we have information of important Oduvars, of people who recited the Tamil devotional hymns, and we have lists of dancers as well. And dance and music was seen as a very important offering to the royal god, and not just an entertainment for the people.
In a way, you've done me, you've put me in a fix. My last question that I have for you has already been answered several times by you, if somebody's listening very carefully, but I'm still going to articulate that, and please sum it up for me. So my final question to you is, in modern times, one looks at history and heritage, and we look at it and we move on. But how can the inheritance of these temples become a part of our lives instead? How can we carry forward their sensibilities so that sad things such as the transformation of what the Devdasi stood for, things like that, don't come to pass?
Priya, I think that is largely to do with the lens that we use to view history. If we view history as a series of events and be obsessed with what happened when, then it will largely become irrelevant for us. It may be interesting if it's in the hands of a good storyteller, but if it's not, it might be largely irrelevant for us. But if we convert that conversation and talk about why did certain things happen? Why did certain kingdoms rise and fall? Why did certain communities rise and fall? Why are certain temples wealthy and thriving even today? Why are some temples completely dilapidated? Then, and if we also look at the how question, apart from the why question, look at how did a king get the money to build a large temple? How did a temple survive for so many thousands of years? How did a community stay relevant for so many thousand years? Then the answers start emerging, and it becomes very relevant for us also. And if you look at, since the focus of today's conversation is on the Cholas, if you look at the Cholas, they were also like any other small kingdom that was fighting to stay afloat in 2000 years back. But suddenly, about 1000 years back, they became literally an internationally famous kingdom, because today the Coromandel coast, or the eastern coast, is called after the Cholas. Many other rulers have ruled the eastern coast of India, but we call it the Coromandel coast or the Cholamandala coast. What happened? Number one, they were very focused about constantly expanding their territory. And after that, they didn't sit idle. They constantly look at how could they administer it better. Number three, in the administration, they were very smart in using temples as surrogate political, economic, and social authorities in each of the village. So they were able to delegate a lot of power and efficiently manage their administration. 4 or 5 of the Chola kings, one after another, they thought about succession planning very, very carefully, which meant that they didn't waste a lot of time fighting civil wars. And finally, why did they lose power? Because towards the end, they became very casual in their approach. They stopped traveling a lot. They stopped working on their military might, and they allowed the Hoysalas from Karnataka and the Pandyas from South Tamil Nadu to overtake them. So all the time, if we take it easy, if we want to constantly live in the comfort zone, history and life will bypass us. But if we are always vigilant, if we are always looking at what else we could do, hopefully we can achieve some impact and live to our fullest potential. I think that's what we can learn from temples. And I think the beauty of the images in your project is that they really project it, and there is nothing like an image to actually make us reflect on these things harder for ourselves.
I agree. So this message that when you look at history, you don't just look at the glory and the opulence and the grandeur of it, but you also look at what went into it and understand why it could have failed. And it normally does so because people begin to take things easy after a while. That's a very good message. And thank you so much, Pradeep.
Thank you, Priya. It was a pleasure doing this.
All the very best for your doctorate. I'm pretty sure it's going to come quickly.
So thank you.
And for the rest of our listeners, tune in to ILF Radio. Let India Lost be found.